There's nothing better during Christmas than a drive out through the country. The natural energy of getting back to the soil, the invigorating scent of Scotch pine in the air. But then I took a wrong turn. There were oil wells pumping, dogs with no legs, and tumbleweeds blowing around, just trying to use a public lavatory, and I was in there, and there's no lights, and that's always an adventure in a public toilet. Then I drove back up to the Bowser, because I needed some petrol, and all of a sudden a tall, lean figure with a Montana accent said, "Hey, you're a Tarnation Bomb." And I said, "Well, yes, because I am." And he led me out like Moses, let my people go. And he put me on the right road back to Calabasas. And he said, "I'm Joel Higgins, but I used to be a monkey and we were born as killing machines."
Wow, that's pretty fucking deep. It's episode 103 of Radio Free Innsmouth. Hey, y'all remember maybe like a year ago, some nerd was talking about the black metal band Sigh?
What we're gonna do right here is go back. Way back into time.
2 bad albums in a row. Sorry, bye-bye, I'm done. And I was done with Sigh for years. I didn't listen to any of their new stuff. It broke my fucking heart. But come last year, they put out a new album that had a really cool cover. They were going way more heavy on the Japanese aesthetics, and it intrigued me. So I decided to give one of my childhood favorite bands another chance, and I was pleasantly surprised.
해보겠습니다.
Yeah, right? That guy sounds like a fucking nerd. Who wouldn't listen to something recorded by that idiot?
Wow.
But yeah, that Sigh album came out 2018. It's 2020 now. I've had a couple years of listening to it, and I've even gone farther back into the portion of the Sigh back catalog that I neglected because I didn't like Hangman's Hymn that much. And I gotta say, not only is Heir to Despair a really, really good album, the analysis of that album will make up the bulk of this episode, but the album before it, Graveword, also a big fan of that. Graveword was cool because it was the first album with Yu Oshima on it. He is now Sigh's main guitarist. It was really cool. Probably talk a little bit more about that guy in a minute. Also, I like that this whole track is based around this weird syncopated drum roll and these little stabs of neoclassical guitar, interspersed with very bombastic orchestration. This particular melodic figure is actually reprised over the course of the album multiple times, very Wagnerian. The vocals here, I think, that's Mika doing that. Normally she just does the growls, but she did some very brassy and brash, clean vocals on this album. And I'm a big fan of them. They're super fucking cool. Overall, this track, it's almost like a weird, bizarre take on pop music by Sigh. Fittingly, they released it as the preview for this album when it came out. And of course, Mariah's got to do his little very Abbott style scream at the end there. But yeah, Graveword. For some reason, the Sigh fan base doesn't seem to enjoy that album that much. I'm not sure why. Like I said, it is the first album that had Yu Oshima on it, who was from the band Cadenza, who were a semi-big deal back in the early 2000s, Japanese black metal solo project. They were on Holy Records, which is pretty fucking cool. I really liked Holy Records back in the day. They did a lot of my favorite weird albums, especially in the mid to late 90s. They put out like that second Tristitia album was really good. That first Yearning album. Put out all the Misanthrope albums. I think the guy from Misanthrope actually owns the label. And of course, those first 2 On Thorns I Lay albums back when they were still a wacky black metal band instead of some weird gothic, frilly, doily, lacy type thing. But anyways, Yu Oshima, major acquisition by Sigh, I would say. He's an interesting character. He had some problems with cancer that he actually had to put Cadenza, his old band, on hold for. And then his home was pretty much like in the middle of that whole like earthquake, reactor meltdown, seawater, radioactive, wacky Fukushima thing that happened. But he managed to beat both of those and then come back and ended up being hired by Sigh to do some very cool stuff on the latest Sigh album, which took a few more years than Mariah would have liked to come out. Actually, in an interview with Metal Storm, of all places. Remember Metal Storm? I saw that he got interviewed by Metal Storm, and I had like a little nostalgic flashback. I hadn't thought about that website probably since I was like maybe 14, 15. They were a big deal back in the day, but they interviewed Mariah, and he said, yeah, sorry the new album's taken a while. I had to learn how to play the fucking flute, because that's how dedicated he is to music. He's like, oh, I could hire like a session flute player, whatever. I'm just gonna like learn to play another musical instrument. I already learned how to play like an oud and a sitar and tablas and all this other stuff. Very cool guy.
Very cool.
Very cool. Very cool.
Very cool.
Very cool. Very cool.
And the concept behind this album is really shown off well by the album cover. If you look at it, so there's, fairly wholesome looking nice lady watering a plant. She has this very like dazed, absent look on her face. Happy, but deliriously so. She's not really looking at what she's watering. The plant itself is dead. In the background, you can see the apartment is in disarray, and she's got pictures up on the wall that are very conspiratorial looking, kind of serial killer-esque yarn and needles tying together cut up photographs, and the whole thing is just very washed out and strange looking in terms of color schemes. Very striking cover. And I think it illustrates the overall theme of the album quite well, which appears to be something about the incompatibility of tradition, in this case sort of a immediately post-war but not modern day, sort of like through the early 80s Japanese culture, and then also, older stuff than that, having problems meshing with sort of global internationalism. That's why they're the heir to despair. Everything's just sort of like collapsing and falling into this gray muck as we're all driven to insanity by the engines of globalism and such.
Archetypal cocksucker.
In the interview with Metal Storm, he says an interesting thing. He talks about how when he was younger, he wasn't a big fan of Japanese traditional culture. He preferred Western culture, which looked cool to him, and that's why he got into heavy metal. But now he started realizing how great the Japanese culture surrounding me when I was a kid was. When I was a little kid, I was some of the top 40s were very, very Japanese. Even us little kids were familiar with those traditional Japanese songs. We didn't like them. I was one of the kids who did not appreciate those traditional Japanese. Well, I didn't know any kids that appreciated it back then. Anyways, at least some Japanese culture remained in our daily lives back then, but now they are all gone, and I miss those days. The songs I hated sounded really good to me nowadays. Heir to Despair is a nostalgia to those lost days. So he started working in a lot more like traditional Japanese music influence. Now we're not talking straight up old Japanese folk music. That would be very hard to do with metal instrumentation, given that you would need probably to take all the frets off the guitar, work entirely in microtones, and then completely disregard the sort of like Western classical music based sense of rhythm with 4/4, 3/4, all those different time signatures and such, since the old very old Japanese traditional music is based around the rhythm of breathing. It's hard to explain. It's interesting to listen to, but it probably wouldn't work that well in a metal context. But he did use sort of like a more Japanese singing technique on the clean vocal sections of this album. You couple that with Yu Oshima's very neoclassical style of guitar playing, very technically adept, but also with a hefty amount of thrash metal influence. You get something that sounds pretty damn interesting. I like the Japanese vocals here. It's very Tom Araya, just spitting out syllables very quickly but clearly and concisely. Kind of a Rain and Blood thing. And then those are the more traditional Japanese music sounding clean vocals that he uses. And then watch what happens when he melds that Tom Araya style spitted vocals with some very neoclassical shredding. That's not even a solo, that's a riff. That like these still aren't even solos. Those are actual guitar riffs. He plays them over and over. It's insane. A lot of respect for that Yu guitarist guy. Very good. And I like the melancholic feel to the clean vocals. Elsewhere on the album, not only do we have a Slayer influence as far as thrash goes, we actually have some very, I guess it's a Teutonic thrash break. It's kind of their own take on a very like 80s mid-paced thrash riff that sort of breaks down the song in the middle of a very neoclassical sounding section. Let's have a listen to that. Some more of those interesting folkish vocals mixed with a very bendy guitar riff. The guitar sound on this album very harsh and fits with the overall vibe of decay and despair. There's more of those fast spit-out Japanese vocals leading into an absolute monster of a thrash break. But with some folk instrumentation mixed in very tastefully. Apparently another influence on this sort of combination of Japanese folk music and metal was the Satori album by the Flower Traveling Band from the 70s. Go and check that out. Very early heavy metal from Japan. And you can hear that in these parts. Also, here comes that flute he was practicing. But with these absolutely crunchy and very memorable guitar riffs, a lot of times when bands start working in a lot of folk and symphonic instrumentation, the guitar riffs will take a bit of a back seat to the overall soundscape. Not so for Sigh, luckily. This riff is very melodic death metal, which makes sense because Niklas Sundin has actually guested on Sigh albums before. That would be the Dark Tranquility guy. They've also, Phil Anselmo shows up on the album, this one that you're listening to. And they've had people like Matt Heafy show up, Killjoy from Necrophagia, all over the place. Mirai maintains his connections well. Very melancholic and desperate guitar melody. Big fan of that. Even if it sounds a little bit like pirate music. And there's some more thrashy stuff. But that melody will come back later. But first we have to get through some very bizarre, sped up riffs. This weird fucking melody. So cool. This might be album of the year for the year it came out for me. I don't know. It and the Peste Noir album from that year, they're actually somewhat similar. They're a combination of traditional folk melodies and a very thrashy, nasty black metal. So if you go later into that song, Homo Homini Lupus, that nautical sounding theme comes back and is enriched with some very sorrowful vocals. And you know I'm big on recurring motifs in music, and I'm sure Mirai is too. I mean, he puts a lot of German in those albums for a reason. Big Wagner guy. Just in case you thought maybe Sigh was going a little bit too traditional heavy metal on this album, we also have the Heresy trilogy in the middle, which is all very much layered, heavily electronic soundscapes. Like the Peste Noir album, which incorporated some trap hip-hop, there is quite a bit of trip-hop on this middle portion of the Sigh album, in between those massive slabs of heavy metal at the beginning and the end. Interesting motivic development in this one too, if you fast forward a little bit further in. So they've actually brought the guitars in, and there's a combination of an electronic drum kit and an acoustic one. And these just weird echoed hand claps, those same clean vocals that are completely unlike anything Sigh had ever done before, but somehow fit exactly with what they're trying to do. It's just grinding industrial metal riff. I'm a big fan of it. And then we get into some very wet sounding analog synthesizers. And sort of a weird take on, I would say this is somewhat Slayer influenced. These very Phrygian and Mixolydian style interlocking guitars, but the percussion is so bare bones that it becomes much more electronic sounding. And of course there's lots of weird spooky noises in the background. There we go. That's pretty Slayerish, and I'm a big fan of that. Heir to Despair. Go out and get it. Grave Word. I haven't listened to Grave Word quite as much. I haven't owned it as long. Probably only listened to it maybe like 30 times as opposed to like Imaginary Sonicscape. I've listened to several hundred times. I've probably listened to certain tracks off of that album like Ecstatic Transformation and Corpse Cry Angel Fall once a day since I got that album, and I would have been like a minor to put it mildly when I first purchased that. So yeah, Sigh are one of my favorite bands, and hopefully you like them too. I don't know. I mean, it's, oh wow, I sure hate good music. You know, if you say stuff like that, you probably won't like Sigh. I don't know. See ya.
Port of call, Stockholm, Sweden. I've been dispatched here by Merv Griffin to meet with our Swedish counterparts, fighting the New World Order. My private jet landed at a remote airstrip here 45 minutes ago. I am now inbound to downtown Stockholm aboard a Forshaga. It's a vintage 1970s Swedish moped with a micro car front, 3 wheels, and a cargo space behind the driver's seat. Can you see him? Eat another slice of Pepe's pizza.